Nolan Turner wasn't the kind of guy who made waves. He liked his coffee black, his lawn freshly mowed, and his evenings quiet. After retiring early from a high-stress government job, as he vaguely put it to the few neighbors who ever asked, Nolan settled into the sleepy HOA-controlled neighborhood of Willow Ridge, like a rock sinking to the bottom of a calm lake. His days were spent tending to his rose bushes, repainting shutters no one noticed needed it, and sitting on his back porch with a book he rarely finished. He wasn't unfriendly, just private. He gave a courteous nod at the mailman, waved at joggers, and even helped the elderly couple across the street lift their new washer into the house once. But beyond that, Nolan was mostly a mystery. He rarely had guests, kept his blinds drawn after dark, and sometimes strange vans came by late at night and parked in his driveway for just a few minutes before vanishing again. That didn't go unnoticed, especially not by Karen Hensley. Karen was the self-appointed queen of Willow Ridge. She didn't just lead the HOA board, she was the HOA. Her clipboard was practically glued to her hip, and her gaze had the intensity of a hawk with something to prove. Every Tuesday, like clockwork, she walked the neighborhood in tennis shoes that had never seen a gym, scribbling down infractions like mailbox needs repainting or grass exceeds 2.5 inches. And Nolan's privacy was a thorn in her perfectly manicured side. It started small. A note on his door reminding him of trash bin placement, a passive-aggressive newsletter highlighting the importance of community transparency. But Nolan never bit. He was polite, nodded when she spoke to him, and then continued doing exactly what he was doing before she interrupted. His calm unnerved her more than defiance would have. Soon, Karen convinced herself that Nolan was hiding something. Why else would he never attend HOA meetings? Why did he have an extra generator behind his house? And who were those men in suits she once saw stepping out of a black SUV and into Nolan's garage for exactly 6 minutes? "He's probably running some kind of illegal operation," she whispered to her best friend Cheryl one morning over coffee. "Or worse, he could be a foreign agent." Cheryl rolled her eyes. "Karen, come on. He's probably just some old tech guy who doesn't like people." But Karen didn't let it go. She began to keep notes. Times, license plates, even drone footage, although she insisted it was just for community safety. Nolan never said anything. He probably didn't know. Or maybe he did. And just didn't care. Behind closed doors, though, Nolan noticed everything. He always had. It was hard to turn that part of his brain off even now. The way Karen's walks lingered near his house longer than others. The camera hidden in the birdhouse across the street. The neighborhood kids who mentioned Mrs. Hensley asked about what kind of job Mr. Turner used to have. He watched quietly, methodically. He made no move to stop her. But the peaceful expression he wore in public began to wear thin behind the curtains. Karen, meanwhile, was on a mission, and she was about to take things way too far. Hey, real quick. If you're enjoying the video so far, make sure to hit that like button, share it with friends, and subscribe for more awesome content. And while you're at it, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. All right, let's keep going. Karen Hensley had always believed she had a sharp eye for suspicious activity. But ever since she set her sights on Nolan Turner, her vigilance had twisted into something darker, something obsessive. It started as routine HOA monitoring, sure, but it quickly spiraled into late-night note-taking, whispered conspiracies, and a sense of righteous paranoia that burned hotter by the day. By the second month of her personal investigation, she had filed 6 separate complaints against Nolan. Most of them were fabricated or exaggerated beyond reason. Allegations like failing to use community-approved mulch or possessing an unregistered garden hose. The HOA board usually dismissed them, with a sigh and a shrug, but Karen wasn't deterred. In her mind, Nolan was hiding something serious, And if the board wouldn't act, she'd take matters into her own hands. "I just know he's up to no good," she told 3 neighbors one morning in her living room, which she had temporarily converted into what she called a community watch headquarters. It was more of a gossip circle with printed Google Maps and color-coded pins than anything official. But Karen had recruited a small following: retirees with too much time, bored empty nesters, and a few folks who just liked the drama. They called themselves the HOA Patrol. Nolan just called them annoying. He'd caught them loitering near his property line a few times, pretending to walk dogs that weren't theirs, or pretending to be on phone calls they clearly weren't having. One even tried to peer through his blinds with binoculars before tripping over a sprinkler head and spraining his ankle. Nolan, for the most part, didn't react. He would step onto his porch, nod politely, and go back inside. But behind the scenes, he was watching everything. Every glance, every footstep, every new lawn ornament that doubled as a camera. He had dealt with worse in his life, much worse, but there was something uniquely irritating about being stalked by suburban vigilantes in pastel cardigans. What none of them could explain, or understand, was the visitors. Once or twice a week, sometimes more, a vehicle would arrive at Nolan's house late at night or very early in the morning. Always unmarked, always dark-colored. The occupants were low profile, average-looking, no flashy clothes, no visible weapons, but they moved, like they were trained, in and out of Nolan's garage in minutes. Karen's imagination went wild with theories. Was it a drug operation? Weapons? Some underground hacker ring? She began documenting the events in a confidential dossier she stored in a locked cabinet in her study. The pages were full of sketches, timestamps, and arrows drawn in red ink, her own little crime thriller in progress. One night she even climbed her garden fence with a thermal camera she'd bought online. She got a blurry image of 2 men loading what looked like a silver briefcase into the back of an SUV. She printed it out and circled the case in thick red marker. "This is it," she whispered to herself. "This is the proof." The more she watched, the more her paranoia bloomed. She barely slept. Her husband had started sleeping in the guest room just to get a full night's rest. But Karen didn't care. She was protecting her neighborhood. If Nolan really was connected to something criminal, well, then she'd be the hero who brought him down. Meanwhile, Nolan sat in his home office with the blinds drawn, reviewing surveillance footage not just from outside, but inside Karen's house. Her drone had passed over a little too close to his rooftop once, and he'd quietly hacked into the signal, pulling her camera feeds into his own system. He didn't like doing it, but he also didn't like being stalked. He leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. "She's getting reckless," he muttered. Still, he didn't act. Not yet. Nolan was used to waiting, reading people, analyzing patterns, letting them dig their own holes before gently, firmly sealing them in. But he was starting to sense that Karen's obsession wasn't just annoying anymore. It was becoming dangerous. It happened on a Wednesday morning. The sun had barely climbed above the rooftops, and most of Willow Ridge was still wrapped in the quiet hush of suburbia. But at the end of Mulberry Lane, Karen Hensley stood in front of Nolan Turner's house with 3 of her so-called HOA patrol members in tow. Clipboards clutched like badges, eyes sharp with a cocktail of fear and self-importance. "He's not home. This is our chance," Karen said in a hushed, breathless tone, glancing toward the driveway where Nolan's silver SUV was noticeably absent. Dale, a former security guard turned neighborhood busybody, shifted uneasily. "Karen, this feels, wrong. Breaking and entering? What if we're not breaking and entering, we're conducting a community welfare check. For the safety of our neighborhood," she snapped, eyes flicking toward Nolan's camera above the porch. She reached up and casually threw a towel over it. "Besides, the HOA bylaws state that if a home is believed to be a public safety risk, The board may act accordingly." "That's not what it says," murmured Cheryl, but Karen was already jiggling the doorknob. It was locked, of course. Then, with surprising force for someone who wore pearls to mow her lawn, she kicked at the door. Once. Twice. The wood cracked and burst inward on the third try. Inside, the house was still. Too still. They stepped in cautiously, their footsteps echoing on the hardwood. Nolan's home was tidy. Too tidy, almost like it had been staged. There were no family photos, no visible clutter, no framed degrees or plaques on the wall, just clean lines, minimalist furniture, and a faint humming sound coming from somewhere deeper inside. Karen led them toward the hallway, eyes scanning like a hawk. She opened a closet, just coats. Checked the kitchen, immaculate. But when she opened a small side door near the staircase, her breath caught. It led to a basement. "We shouldn't go down there," Dale muttered. But Karen was already descending. The basement wasn't dark. It was cold, sterile, and bathed in low blue light from rows of servers and panels, blinking with activity. Wires snaked across the floor in bundles. A digital map glowed on one wall, dotted with what looked like satellite markers. On another, a bank of monitors displayed footage, not of the neighborhood but of locations far away. Military bases, city intersections, foreign embassies. "What in the hell?" Cheryl whispered. Karen's heart raced with excitement. She couldn't believe it. This wasn't just some cranky recluse with a few security cameras. This was something big. Illegal surveillance, espionage, maybe even terrorism. She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures feverishly, hands trembling. "We have to report this now," she said. Dale and Cheryl turned to leave, but Karen wasn't done. She opened a locked cabinet with a screwdriver she'd brought just in case. Inside, she found hard drives, a sealed case labeled "Do Not Tamper," and a small black box with what looked like a thumbprint scanner. "This is evidence," she declared. They didn't know that tampering with that box would trigger an encrypted, fail-safe protocol. But they were already halfway out the door when Karen pulled out her second phone, the one she used for official HOA business, and dialed both the police and the local news station. Within 30 minutes, flashing lights painted Nolan's front lawn red and blue. By then, Karen had positioned herself on the porch like she was giving a press briefing. Reporters gathered around as she explained, with great flair, how she had courageously uncovered a hidden surveillance operation embedded in their quiet little neighborhood. "He's been running something shady for months," she told the cameras, holding up her phone with the blurry basement photos. "We believe this may go all the way to federal crimes, possibly even international." The police, confused and caught off guard, did what they could. They cordoned off the house, took statements, and began securing the site, though they quickly realized the equipment inside was far beyond anything they were trained to handle. Karen was glowing. Finally, she had exposed the man who had eluded her grasp for so long. The man who never came to potlucks or waved back when she passed by. But what she didn't realize, what none of them realized, was that by crossing that threshold, by tampering with that equipment, they had set something much bigger into motion. At exactly 1:12 p.m., while Karen was still answering questions from a Channel 9 reporter, a pair of black SUVs rolled silently into the neighborhood and parked across the street. The men who stepped out wore no visible badges. No words were exchanged. They didn't knock. They just walked right past the stunned officers, into Nolan's house, and closed the door behind them. Karen froze mid-sentence. "What? Who are they?" she asked, voice cracking. No one answered her, because now, this wasn't her show anymore. Nolan knew something was wrong the moment he turned the corner onto Mulberry Lane. His SUV slowed to a crawl as he took in the police tape, flapping in the breeze, the scattering of nosy neighbors lingering on their lawns, and the unmistakable sight of his front door, split at the frame, hanging crooked on broken hinges. The edges of his jaw tightened. No sirens, no flashing lights. Just chaos in the quiet. He parked in his driveway with the calm of a man who had been trained never to react too quickly. As he stepped out, heads turned. Whispers floated from across the street. Karen was already waiting for him at the edge of his lawn, arms crossed, lips pursed like a self-righteous school principal who had just caught a student cheating. "I'm sure this is all a surprise to you, Nolan," she began, her voice dripping with a smugness she didn't bother to hide. "But the community has a right to know if something dangerous is happening under our noses. I acted decisively for everyone's safety." Nolan stood silent. He didn't look at her. He didn't speak. He simply stepped past her, into his ransacked home. Inside, it was worse than he'd expected. Cabinets flung open, drawers emptied, panels pried loose. Even his encrypted case had been tampered with, and that wasn't just reckless. That was federal territory. Still, he didn't slam a fist against the wall. He didn't yell. He just pulled out his phone and tapped a secure number. The voice on the other end picked up before the first ring finished. "It's Turner. We've got a breach." There was a pause. Then a calm voice responded. "Are you compromised?" "No," Nolan replied, his voice low and measured. "But the locals walked into a hornet's nest. I need containment. Quiet, but firm." "Understood." Nolan hung up. Outside, Karen strutted around the yard like a peacock in full display. She was already planning her follow-up interview for the 6 o'clock news, half expecting Nolan to be arrested on the spot. She couldn't stop replaying the image of the mysterious basement, those blinking lights, those suspicious maps. She was certain she'd just exposed a high-level criminal, or at the very least someone with enough skeletons to fill a walk-in closet. But that night, the tone began to change. It started with the silence. The kind of silence that doesn't feel natural. The neighborhood seemed to hold its breath as the sun dipped low behind the rooftops. Around 9 p.m., Karen noticed the first SUV roll in. Black, tinted windows, no plates. It turned slowly into Nolan's driveway and stopped. Headlights, dying without a sound. Then came another, and another. She counted 4 in total. From her upstairs window, she narrowed her eyes, one hand clutching a mug of chamomile tea she suddenly didn't want anymore. Men in dark suits stepped out. They weren't police, too smooth. No visible guns. But they moved with a practiced efficiency that made her stomach tighten. She grabbed her phone, thinking to call someone, anyone, but hesitated. Who would she even call? The local police had already been brushed aside earlier in the day like school children who'd stumbled into a physics lecture. These weren't small-town cops or city detectives. They were something else. Downstairs, her husband mumbled something about maybe letting this go, but Karen ignored him. She kept watching as the men disappeared into Nolan's house, carrying nothing but briefcases and calm expressions. They didn't knock. They didn't explain. They simply entered and closed the door. Across the street, porch lights flicked off. One by one, Karen's smugness began to waver. "What is going on over there?" she whispered, heart beating just a little faster now. She told herself this was still a victory. She had exposed him, after all. Right? And yet, something about the stillness of the night, the quiet efficiency of those men, and Nolan's unreadable silence unnerved her more than she wanted to admit. She watched until midnight, and the SUVs never left. Karen was still in her robe when the knock came. It wasn't the kind of knock that invited casual curiosity. It was sharp, measured, intentional. The kind of knock that said, "This is not a request." Her breath hitched as she approached the front door, robe cinched tightly, coffee forgotten on the counter behind her. She pulled back the curtain just a sliver, and froze. Two men stood on her porch, dark suits pressed, badges already out. Their expressions were neutral, professional. The taller one had the look of someone who hadn't smiled since the Clinton administration. The other simply tapped his badge again just to make sure she'd seen it clearly. "Mrs. Hensley," the taller one said when she cracked open the door. "We're with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. May we come in?" Karen hesitated. "Is this about Nolan Turner?" she asked, trying to summon that righteous tone she wore like perfume. But it came out thinner this time. Weaker. The agent just looked at her. "Yes, let's talk inside." Her husband, Paul, was already up from the breakfast table, confused and concerned. He offered a weak smile to the agents, motioning toward the couch. The living room suddenly felt smaller, tighter, like the air had been pulled out of it. "We're conducting an official inquiry into the events that occurred yesterday at Mr. Turner's residence," the second agent said, flipping open a small notepad. "According to several witness statements and your own call to the police, you and 3 others unlawfully entered Mr. Turner's home." Karen straightened up. "I acted within my rights as head of the HOA. We believed he was conducting suspicious activity, illegal even, and we were concerned for the safety of our community." The taller agent raised a brow. "Do you have any legal training, Mrs. Hensley?" Well, no, but I've read the bylaws." Section 14A clearly states that the HOA has the right to investigate potential violations. The agent didn't even blink. Section 14A does not supersede federal law. Karen opened her mouth to argue but found herself at a loss. Her throat went dry. "You didn't just break into a private residence," the second agent continued. "You disrupted an active federal communications node. Mr. Turner is a contracted liaison with clearance to operate a secure intelligence relay for counter-cyber operations. That basement you ransacked? It's classified infrastructure." Karen blinked. "A relay? For what?" "Encrypted transmissions. Government to government, foreign intelligence partnerships. Data links for ongoing cybercrime investigations. Some of those signals were routed directly through here. Your neighborhood. Your break-in triggered an automatic fail-safe protocol, which rerouted multiple agencies into defensive posture. You may have compromised months of active surveillance." Paul sat down slowly. The blood drained from Karen's face. I thought he was spying on us." "No," the taller agent said flatly. "He was helping protect people like you from much bigger threats than overgrown lawns and unsanctioned mailbox paint." There was no satisfaction in his tone. Just cold, brutal clarity. "We need you to provide a full statement. Names of everyone involved. And you should advise your HOA patrol to expect interviews today. This isn't just a neighborhood dispute anymore." Karen's lips parted but no sound came out. All those times she'd written passive-aggressive notices, snooped through shrubbery, complained about porch lights being too bright at night. They seemed small now, insignificant. Worse, they seemed dangerously naive. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I swear, I thought he was hiding something." "He was," the agent said. "It just wasn't what you thought." By the time they left, Karen's legs felt like rubber. She slumped into a chair and stared at the cold cup of coffee she'd poured that morning. Paul sat across from her, silent, fiddling with his wedding band. Across the street, Nolan's home looked untouched again. The door had been repaired. The SUVs were gone. Just like that, things looked normal. But now Karen knew better. By noon, FBI agents were knocking on Cheryl's door, then Dale's. Clipboards, badges, calm voices and quiet questions that didn't leave room for excuses. The neighborhood buzzed with unease, but no one dared to ask too many questions out loud. Nolan, meanwhile, was outside watering his rose bushes like it was just another Saturday. Karen watched from behind her blinds, a sick twist in her stomach. He didn't even look in her direction. No gloating, no confrontation. Just a man who had let the storm pass and was now tending to his flowers. And that, somehow, was worse than anything he could have said. She sat back down, her world a little smaller than it had been the day before. The queen of the HOA, reduced to a cautionary tale in her own story. And it wasn't over yet. The spotlight Karen had once craved became her undoing. Just days ago, she was the self-proclaimed protector of the neighborhood, the gatekeeper of order and community values. Now she was a name on a federal report, a face splashed across the evening news with the headline, HOA president accused of breaking into government contractor's home. The camera footage didn't flatter her. Local Channel 9 had aired clips from Nolan's Ring doorbell, showing Karen strutting up to his house with a clipboard in one hand and a crowbar in the other. They looped the footage over and over, her voice ringing out, "We have every right to investigate." The segment cut to a retired federal prosecutor explaining, in careful detail, how what Karen had done constituted criminal trespass, destruction of federal property, and obstruction of an ongoing investigation. By the next morning, the whispers on Mulberry Lane had turned into avoidance. The very neighbors who once nodded approvingly at her obsessive flyers, who once followed her on community patrol walks, now avoided eye contact. Cheryl, her former sidekick, removed herself from the HOA board. Dale put up a for sale sign in his yard without a word. Even the Johnson twins, usually the first to tattle on sidewalk chalk violations, were seen hurriedly dragging their scooters inside when Karen walked past. Karen clung to the illusion of control like a woman gripping the railing of a sinking ship. She called an emergency HOA meeting. Only 2 board members showed up, both looking deeply uncomfortable. When she began ranting about misinformation and media bias, one of them quietly packed up and left halfway through. The other simply said, "Maybe it's time to step back, Karen." Even her own home wasn't safe from the fallout. Her husband Paul had grown cold, resentful. He barely spoke, and when he did, it was curt. Her teenage son, humiliated by classmates who saw the news segment, stopped coming down for dinner altogether. At one point, she caught him stuffing his backpack with clothes. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice brittle. "Anywhere. Else?" he muttered, slamming the door behind him. Then the letter came. A formal notice, printed on crisp government letterhead, from the Department of Justice. She was being charged with obstruction of a federal investigation and unlawful entry into a secured property. Her attorney, who she'd scrambled to find through an old acquaintance, was clear. Best case scenario, she'd face a hefty fine and probation. Worst case? Jail time. But the real hammer dropped 2 days later. Nolan filed a civil suit, not just against Karen, but against the entire HOA board. The claim included destruction of personal and federal property, violation of civil rights, and emotional distress. The damages? 7 figures. Karen sat at her kitchen table staring at the paperwork, hands trembling slightly. "We were trying to protect the community," she mumbled to herself. But deep down, she knew that wasn't the whole truth. She hadn't done it for the community. She did it because Nolan made her feel powerless, mysterious, unreadable. He didn't comply. He didn't bow to her authority. And that infuriated her. She had to control him, had to prove she was still the one calling the shots. Now everything was slipping through her fingers. HOA members resigned. New elections were called. A law firm specializing in HOA abuse cases stepped in to advise the neighborhood on dismantling the board entirely. Karen's name, once synonymous with order, had become a local curse word. One afternoon, as she collected her mail, eyes darting toward Nolan's home across the street, she saw him. He was sipping coffee on the porch, sunglasses on, casually flipping through a book. He didn't even look at her. And that somehow burned worse than any words he could have said, because she wasn't worth his anger. Not anymore. She was just another cautionary tale. A reminder that power, once abused, has a nasty way of turning on you. Karen turned back to her house, her kingdom now reduced to silence, and stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind her, but the echoes of her mistakes were just beginning to ring. It wasn't a town hall meeting, and it wasn't a press conference. Nolan didn't do theatrics. Instead, it was a quiet Saturday morning. The HOA's old bulletin board, once plastered with Karen's laminated notices, was now nearly bare. A folding table had been set up near the neighborhood playground. Nolan stood behind it, hands tucked into the pockets of his Nolanette, a small speaker beside him. Roughly 24 neighbors gathered. Some stood with arms crossed, some with curious expressions, others shifting awkwardly, eyes down. Karen wasn't there. She wouldn't have dared. Nolan looked around at the crowd. Then he picked up the mic, his voice low and even. "I didn't want to have to do this," he said. "I've always believed in keeping to myself. I work in a field that requires privacy and discretion, a lot of it, not because I'm hiding something from you, but because my work involves protecting people you'll never meet, from threats you'll never see." He paused, letting that sit. "No flair, no drama, just fact. I live here because I wanted peace. I wanted a garden, a quiet porch, birds instead of alarms. But what happened over the last few weeks? That wasn't peace." Some shifted in place. A few winced. "I'm not here to point fingers," Nolan continued. "You've already seen how that played out. I'm not angry. I'm disappointed. Deeply. Because all anyone had to do was knock. Ask. Treat me like a neighbor, not a threat." His gaze moved over the crowd. Not cold, not sharp. Just tired. "I can't explain everything I do. Legally, I'm not allowed to. But I can say this. The equipment in my home was there with full federal approval. Its purpose was critical. When that was damaged, it didn't just affect me. It affected people way beyond this street." There was a long silence. "I hope, truly, that this community learns from this. Curiosity isn't a crime, but suspicion, without cause, acting on fear instead of facts, that's where we crossed the line." Nolan stepped back. No grand exit, no applause. Just quiet reflection as the speaker clicked off. Some neighbors came up afterward one by one. Apologies, handshakes, awkward nods. No one dared ask more than what he'd given. And he didn't offer more than he needed to. Later that day, someone left a fresh pie on his porch. A few kids rode their bikes past and waved instead of turning away. The whispers stopped. The glances softened. Nolan didn't need to clear his name. He just reminded them of what it used to mean to be a good neighbor. Karen's fall from grace wasn't loud. It was excruciatingly quiet. No police sirens, no handcuffs in front of flashing cameras. Just a resignation letter slid under the HOA's door, typed and unsigned. She vanished from the board within a week, and within a month, she vanished from the neighborhood altogether. Her house, once the bastion of over-trimmed hedges, seasonal, lawn flags and a camera pointed suspiciously toward Nolan's yard, was dark. The blinds stayed closed. The "for sale" sign appeared suddenly one morning, and by afternoon, the whispers began. Some said she was avoiding court dates. Others claimed she'd moved in with a distant cousin to escape the mounting lawsuits. A few suspected she might still be under surveillance, but no one knew for sure, and no one dared ask. The HOA was gutted and rebuilt from the ground up. This time, actual rules were followed. Transparency was emphasized, and the new board adopted a refreshing policy. If it's not a problem for the community, don't make it one. Nolan? He didn't say much during the transition. He showed up to the first new HOA meeting, nodded once in approval, and left early. But those who watched closely noticed subtle changes around his house. A reinforced steel door replaced the standard. Front entrance. Cameras, small, sleek, military-grade, were installed at every corner of the property, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. One neighbor joked, "It's like Fort Knox over there." Nolan just smiled and said, "Peace of mind, that's all." But peace wasn't entirely restored. Every so often, unmarked black SUVs with tinted windows would idle near the curb. A man in a suit might knock on Nolan's door, stay for less than 10 minutes, and leave without a word. At night, faint blue glows would pulse from the basement windows, barely visible but always consistent. Nolan never confirmed anything, never denied anything either. He spent his days gardening again. The tomatoes came in sweeter that summer. Birds returned to his feeders, and the squirrels seemed bolder than ever. It was as if the land, like the man who tended it, was beginning to heal. Then, one late afternoon, a moving truck pulled up across the street, Karen's old place. Nolan watched from his porch, sipping tea, as a young couple and their daughter stepped out, all bright smiles and cardboard boxes. They waved to Nolan. He waved back. A moment later, the husband, tall, ex-military build, walked over. "Hey there," the man said, extending a hand. "I'm Mike. Just moved in. Looking forward to some quiet, finally." Nolan chuckled softly. "You've come to the right place, more or less." They shook hands, firm and respectful. There was a glint in Mike's eye. Nolan caught it. Military. "Yes, but something else too." "You in the service?" Nolan asked casually. "Used to be. Still do contract work here and there. Communication systems mostly." Nolan raised an eyebrow. "Small world?" Mike smiled knowingly as if he'd already heard the rumors. "I was briefed." Nolan didn't flinch. "Then you know enough to know I won't be a problem." Mike's grin widened. "That's why I moved here." They exchanged a nod, an unspoken agreement between men who'd lived long enough to know better than to ask questions they didn't want answered. As Mike returned to his family, Nolan leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting toward the old oak tree by his driveway. It had stood through storms, lightning, and even Karen's reign of tyranny. Just like him. He reached over and tapped a small switch on the arm of his chair. In the yard, a section of the flower bed hummed faintly, then sank, a few inches into the ground, revealing nothing, at least nothing obvious. Then the panel closed again, blending seamlessly into the soil. Nolan smiled. Some secrets were never meant for HOA meetings, Karen's clipboard, or even FBI reports. Some secrets belonged to the quiet ones, the ones who didn't shout, the ones who watched, waited, and when necessary, acted. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden hue across the neighborhood, Nolan sat back in his chair and finally, truly, relaxed because peace had returned. And this time, he was ready to protect it. If you enjoyed this video and want to see the next part, let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated. See you in the next one. Your support means the world.